Imagine a life that appears picture perfect, a successful career, a beautiful home, and a seemingly happy family. But what if, beneath the surface, everything is unraveling? This is the story of Clara and David Harris, a story of love, betrayal, and unimaginable tragedy. Clara Harris, a brilliant dentist, and her husband, David, an esteemed orthodontist, were living what looked like the American dream in the heart of Houston, Texas. Together, they built a life of affluence and prestige, one that many would envy. But as the saying goes, not all that glitters is gold. Behind the closed doors of their suburban life, the cracks were already forming. Their marriage, once full of love and promise, began to strain under the weight of secrets, insecurities, and betrayal. Clara, a woman of grace and professional achievement, found herself trapped in a storm of emotions when the man she loved, her husband, David, was slipping away. David, too, faced his own inner turmoil, caught between his professional success and personal desires, which would ultimately lead both of them down a road that neither could have ever imagined. This story doesn't just examine a crime, it explores the fragility of human emotions and how, in one moment of rage, everything can change forever. Clara Harris, a woman driven by a complex mix of love, jealousy, and betrayal, would see her perfect world collapse, and the consequences would be fatal. This is where our investigation begins, unraveling the truth behind the mask of an ordinary suburban couple and the events that led to one of the most shocking crimes in Houston's history. As time passed, the once seemingly perfect marriage between Clara and David Harris began to deteriorate, revealing fractures that had been quietly growing beneath the surface. What had started as a union full of love and mutual admiration was now being eroded by resentment, distance, and unspoken tension. For Clara, the signs were everywhere, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. David, once attentive and loving, became increasingly distant. He was no longer the affectionate man who had courted her so passionately. Instead, he grew withdrawn, spending long hours away from home, absorbed in his work or finding reasons to avoid the emotional strain that was slowly poisoning their relationship. Clara felt the change deeply. The more David pulled away, the more she clung to the idea of fixing what was broken, but her efforts were met with coldness and indifference. Every time she tried to rekindle the spark, she was met with a wall of silence or, worse, irritation. David's dissatisfaction went beyond their home. Though professionally successful, he seemed restless, searching for something that Clara could no longer provide. His discontentment spilled into every corner of their marriage, leaving Clara to grapple with the growing fear that she was losing him. She watched helplessly as he drifted further into his own world, emotionally unavailable and detached. Conversations that once flowed easily now turned into tense, brief exchanges. Clara could feel herself slipping into a state of desperation, trying harder to win him back, but with every attempt she felt the sting of rejection more acutely. For Clara, this shift in their dynamic was unbearable. She prided herself on her image, a successful dentist, a devoted wife, and a stepmother to David's daughter Lindsay. But with every passing day, that image began to crack, leaving her feeling vulnerable and powerless. Clara's emotional world was unraveling, and the more she tried to hold it together, the more she felt it slipping through her fingers. David's growing dissatisfaction left Clara feeling like a failure, both as a wife and as a woman. The emotional gap between them widened, and the love that had once bound them together now felt like a distant memory. What Clara didn't yet realize was that this crumbling marriage was setting the stage for a devastating chain of events that would push her to the edge of reason and beyond. The stage was set for tragedy, and Clara's growing desperation would soon take her down a dark path where love, rage, and betrayal would collide with catastrophic consequences. It was the moment that shattered everything Clara Harris had held onto, the moment when all her suspicions became a heartbreaking reality. For months, she had sensed something was wrong, but nothing could have prepared her for the truth. Her husband, David, the man she had devoted her life to, was having an affair. The other woman was Gail Bridges, a receptionist who worked at David's orthodontic practice, a woman who had quietly slipped into their lives and stolen what was left of Clara's crumbling marriage. The signs had been there, small at first, almost invisible to anyone not living in Clara's shoes. Late nights at the office became more frequent. David's excuses for being away grew increasingly vague. He was always too tired, too busy, too stressed to engage with Clara when he finally came home. And then there were the changes in his behavior, the secretive phone calls, the unexplained absences, the distant look in his eyes when she tried to talk to him. But for Clara, the most telling sign was the way David no longer looked at her. The love, or even the acknowledgement, in his gaze was gone. Clara's suspicions built slowly, but when she overheard a whispered phone conversation late one night, her worst fears were confirmed. David's tone was soft, intimate, nothing like the clipped, distant way he had been speaking to her for months. She knew in that moment something was terribly wrong. From there, it was only a matter of time before she pieced together the devastating truth. Clara didn't confront David right away. Instead, she began her own investigation, determined to uncover the evidence. She checked his phone bills, noticing repeated calls to a single number, Gail's number. She watched his behavior more closely, picking up on the subtle lies and inconsistencies in his schedule. The final piece of the puzzle came when Clara, in a moment of quiet desperation, followed David to his office one afternoon, only to see him leave with Gail. The way they interacted, the shared laughter, the way David's hand lingered on Gail's arm confirmed everything. The betrayal hit Clara like a tidal wave. The man she had loved, the life they had built together, had been a lie. She felt her world collapse around her, leaving behind only a raw, burning sense of betrayal. Clara's mind raced, torn between confronting David and burying her pain. The affair wasn't just a betrayal of her marriage, it was an assault on her identity, her self worth, and everything she had fought to hold on to. When Clara finally confronted David, her worst nightmare was spoken aloud. David didn't deny it. His affair with Gail had been ongoing, and it was clear from his reaction that this wasn't just a fleeting moment of weakness. It was something deeper. In that instant, Clara's world shattered completely. She was no longer just the wife of a cheating husband, she was a woman scorned, driven to the edge by the ultimate betrayal. What Clara couldn't know then was how this discovery would ignite a dangerous storm of emotions inside her, one that would consume her every thought and lead her down a path from which there would be no return. The affair was no longer just a secret, it was a ticking time bomb, and soon it would explode with devastating consequences. The revelation of David's affair pushed Clara Harris into an emotional free fall. What had been a growing sense of unease quickly spiraled into something darker, an all consuming obsession that took hold of her every thought. She couldn't escape the images of David with Gail, the betrayal burning in her mind like a relentless fire. The pain was so deep, so raw, that it clouded Clara's judgment, blurring the lines between reality and the version of her life she desperately wanted to save.
Clara's response was both frantic and heartbreaking. She became fixated on winning David back, convinced that if she tried hard enough, she could undo the damage. She showered him with affection, clung to any shred of normalcy in their interactions, and made every effort to reignite the spark that had long since faded. But no matter what she did, it was clear that David's mind and heart were elsewhere.
As David pulled further away, Clara's jealousy grew, turning into a powerful force that drove her every move. She became obsessed with Gail, haunted by the idea that this woman had taken her place in David's life. Clara's thoughts were consumed by the affair. Where was David now? Was he with her? What was he telling Gail that he wasn't telling her? Every glance, every word, every action from David was now scrutinized, dissected, and twisted by Clara's growing paranoia. Her desperation led to extreme behaviors, constantly checking David's phone, monitoring his movements, and questioning every little detail. It wasn't just about the affair anymore, it was about her own identity, her sense of worth. Clara was losing control, and with that loss came the crushing fear that everything she had built with David was slipping away. The more she tried to save the marriage, the further she descended into a cycle of jealousy, anger, and helplessness. Each failed attempt to reconnect with David only deepened her obsession. As Clara's emotions spiraled, she began to feel cornered, trapped in a situation she couldn't control. The fear of losing David, coupled with the humiliation of his betrayal, was unbearable. The marriage had been the foundation of her life, her anchor, and now that anchor was dragging her down into the darkest parts of herself. Clara was a woman undone, teetering on the edge of reason, driven by the overwhelming desire to reclaim what she felt was rightfully hers. But in her desperate attempts to hold onto David, Clara was losing herself, and with each passing day, the situation grew more volatile. As Clara's emotional state continued to deteriorate, her desperation took a more calculated turn. She needed proof, something undeniable that would force David to face his infidelity in the harshest light. Clara believed that if she could confront him with cold, hard evidence, he would have no choice but to end the affair and come back to her. It was this belief that led her to hire a private investigator from Blue Moon Investigations. Clara's decision to involve a private investigator was driven by her need for control over a situation that felt wildly out of her hands. She wanted facts, something concrete to confirm what she already knew in her heart. Clara didn't just want to accuse David of cheating, she wanted to corner him with indisputable evidence, leaving no room for denial or excuses. The investigator would be her eyes when she couldn't be there, capturing David's every move, providing proof that she could use to confront him or perhaps even destroy him. Blue Moon Investigations, known for their discretion and thoroughness, took the case. Clara's instructions were simple: follow David, document his interactions with Gail, and gather as much visual evidence as possible. It didn't take long for the investigator to catch David in the act. He followed David to secret meetings, carefully recording each interaction with hidden cameras. Photographs, videos, every piece of evidence was carefully compiled, painting a clear picture of David's ongoing betrayal. The footage was damning. It showed David and Gail together at restaurants, walking side by side, talking intimately, and exchanging gestures that made it clear this was more than a passing fling. In one particularly revealing piece of surveillance, the investigator captured them entering the Nassau Bay Hilton, the very hotel where Clara's life would change forever. The images were undeniable. They confirmed everything Clara feared, but also solidified something deeper inside her, a sense that this affair was no longer something she could fix. The private investigator's work didn't just provide Clara with proof, it fueled her already burning rage. With every photo, every video clip, Clara's emotions escalated. Seeing David with Gail, captured so coldly on camera, made it all too real. This wasn't just suspicion or jealousy, this was fact, and the facts were brutal. Clara now had the evidence she needed, but instead of bringing clarity or resolution, it only deepened her obsession. The truth, in all its stark reality, had been laid bare. The question now was, what would Clara do with this knowledge? The answer would soon reveal itself in the most devastating way possible. The Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel became the setting for the final, irreversible crack in Clara Harris's already shattered world. It was a warm July evening, but inside Clara, a storm was raging, a tempest of jealousy, betrayal, and heartbreak that had been building to this moment. Clara had discovered David's plan to meet Gail at the hotel, a fact confirmed by the private investigator she had hired. But this wasn't just a clandestine meeting between lovers, it was the place where Clara's hope for reconciliation would come crashing down. What made the scene even more unsettling was that Clara did not arrive alone. With her was Lindsay Harris, her teenage stepdaughter, who had already been dragged into the emotional wreckage of her parents' deteriorating marriage. Lindsay had idolized her father, and Clara believed that seeing his infidelity firsthand might somehow unite them both against David's betrayal. But in reality, Clara's decision to bring Lindsay along was a moment of devastating miscalculation, one that would haunt the young girl forever. As Clara and Lindsay entered the hotel lobby, Clara's emotions were already on the brink of collapse. She spotted David with Gail almost immediately. The sight of them together, so close, so intimate, set her mind ablaze. Everything she had feared, everything she had obsessed over, was playing out right before her eyes. David and Gail were relaxed, unaware that Clara was watching them from a distance, the tension between her and the couple visible even to bystanders. The confrontation was inevitable. Clara approached David and Gail, her voice sharp with rage and accusation. David, caught off guard, tried to downplay the situation, but Clara's fury was uncontainable. What began as an argument quickly spiraled into a chaotic scene, with Clara's emotions pouring out in a stream of accusations and pleas. Witnesses in the hotel recalled how heated the confrontation became, with Clara demanding answers, demanding acknowledgement of the betrayal that had ripped apart her life. Lindsay, watching from the sidelines, was in shock. She had looked up to her father, and now she was witnessing the complete unraveling of her family in public view. For the teenager, this moment was not just an argument between her parents, it was the moment her entire world shifted. What she saw was not just her stepmother's pain, but the man she adored reduced to an object of shame and guilt. Clara, however, was past the point of reason. The emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long had now erupted. Her goal had been to confront David, to expose him, but as she stood in the hotel lobby, watching the man she loved with the woman who had stolen him away, something inside her snapped. What followed would change everything, sealing the tragic fate of that evening. The Nassau Bay Hilton Hotel became the setting for the final, irreversible crack in Clara Harris's already shattered world. It was a warm July evening, but inside Clara, a storm was raging, a tempest of jealousy, betrayal, and heartbreak that had been building to this moment. Clara had discovered David's plan to meet Gail at the hotel, a fact confirmed by the private investigator she had hired. But this wasn't just a clandestine meeting between lovers, it was the place where Clara's hope for reconciliation would come crashing down. What made the scene even more unsettling was that Clara did not arrive alone. With her was Lindsay Harris, her teenage stepdaughter, who had already been dragged into the emotional wreckage of her parents' deteriorating marriage. Lindsay had idolized her father, and Clara believed that seeing his infidelity firsthand might somehow unite them both against David's betrayal. But in reality, Clara's decision to bring Lindsay along was a moment of devastating miscalculation, one that would haunt the young girl forever. As Clara and Lindsay entered the hotel lobby, Clara's emotions were already on the brink of collapse. She spotted David with Gail almost immediately. The sight of them together, so close, so intimate, set her mind ablaze. Everything she had feared, everything she had obsessed over, was playing out right before her eyes. David and Gail were relaxed, unaware that Clara was watching them from a distance, the tension between her and the couple visible even to bystanders. The confrontation was inevitable. Clara approached David and Gail, her voice sharp with rage and accusation. David, caught off guard, tried to downplay the situation, but Clara's fury was uncontainable. What began as an argument quickly spiraled into a chaotic scene, with Clara's emotions pouring out in a stream of accusations and pleas. Witnesses in the hotel recalled how heated the confrontation became, with Clara demanding answers, demanding acknowledgement of the betrayal that had ripped apart her life. Lindsay, watching from the sidelines, was in shock. She had looked up to her father, and now she was witnessing the complete unraveling of her family in public view. For the teenager, this moment was not just an argument between her parents, it was the moment her entire world shifted. What she saw was not just her stepmother's pain, but the man she adored reduced to an object of shame and guilt. Clara, however, was past the point of reason. The emotions that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long had now erupted. Her goal had been to confront David, to expose him, but as she stood in the hotel lobby, watching the man she loved with the woman who had stolen him away, something inside her snapped. What followed would change everything, sealing the tragic fate of that evening. The final act of Clara Harris's emotional descent took place in the parking lot of the Nassau Bay Hilton under the dim glow of streetlights. After the chaotic confrontation inside, Clara stormed out of the hotel, her mind a whirlwind of rage, betrayal, and desperation. But she wasn't done, not yet. The emotional fire within her had not burned out, it had only grown hotter, more intense, and more dangerous. David and Gail emerged from the hotel shortly after, unaware of the deadly storm about to unfold. They had tried to make a quick exit, but Clara was waiting. Sitting in her Mercedes Benz, her hands gripping the steering wheel, Clara's eyes locked onto David and Gail as they walked toward their cars. All the pain, the betrayal, and the anger that had built up inside her came rushing to the surface in that moment. Without warning, Clara slammed her foot on the gas pedal, her vision blurred by fury. The car roared forward, aimed directly at David. The impact was sudden and brutal. Witnesses later described the horrifying scene: Clara's Mercedes striking David, sending him tumbling to the ground. But Clara didn't stop. As onlookers screamed, Clara circled around, hitting David again and again with chilling precision. Her car crushed him under its weight multiple times, each blow fueled by the emotional inferno that had consumed her. Lindsay, who had been in the passenger seat of the car, could only watch in stunned disbelief. In those few chaotic moments, her father was gone, crushed beneath the wheels of the car driven by the very woman who had promised to love and protect him. Her stepmother's actions would be seared into her memory forever. Witnesses described Lindsay's pleas, screaming for Clara to stop, her voice filled with both horror and helplessness. But Clara was beyond reach, lost in a rage that could not be stopped. The crowd that had gathered stood frozen, unable to process the violence unfolding before their eyes. Some rushed to call emergency services, others watched in stunned silence as the scene played out. In those few short moments, David Harris, a man who had once been a loving husband, father, and respected orthodontist, lay dead in a parking lot, killed by the very woman he had shared his life with. Clara, once a poised and successful dentist, had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her rage, her desperation, had driven her to a point of no reason, and the consequences were fatal. In a matter of seconds, her life and the lives of everyone around her were irrevocably changed. What had begun as a confrontation between a wife, a husband, and a lover had now become a crime scene, one that would capture the attention of an entire nation. The Nassau Bay Hilton parking lot would forever be remembered as the place where Clara Harris's love for her husband transformed into something unrecognizable, something deadly. The fatal moment was over, but the repercussions of that night were only just beginning. The events that unfolded outside the Nassau Bay Hilton were witnessed by several individuals, and their testimonies would play a critical role in understanding the chilling actions of Clara Harris on that fateful night. Hotel guests, staff, and bystanders who were going about their evening suddenly found themselves witnesses to a scene of unimaginable violence. One witness, a hotel valet, recalled the confrontation in the lobby just before the incident. He described how Clara had stormed into the hotel, visibly distressed, and how the argument with David quickly escalated. She looked like she was on the verge of losing it, he later testified. He had watched the argument from a distance, but had no idea of the tragedy that would follow outside. Another hotel guest who had been sitting in the lobby described how she saw Clara's eyes filled with fury, betrayal, and grief as she confronted her husband and his lover. You could feel her pain. It was almost tangible, like something you could reach out and touch, she said in her testimony. She recalled the scene outside the hotel where Clara drove her Mercedes Benz, at first in what appeared to be an attempt to intimidate David. But what happened next shocked everyone. The most heart-wrenching testimonies came from those who witnessed the fatal moment. One witness described the sound of the engine revving and the sickening thud as the car struck David's body. She hit him like she was possessed, one bystander recalled. It wasn't an accident. You could see it in her face. She knew exactly what she was doing. The onlooker's horror grew as Clara circled back, hitting David again, and then a third time, each impact seeming more deliberate than the last. A member of the hotel staff, shaken by the brutality of the scene, called it the most terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. His voice trembled as he gave his statement to the police, recounting how Clara's expression went from one of pure rage to a haunting, vacant stare after the attack. It was like she wasn't even there anymore, he said, capturing the emotional descent that had overtaken Clara in the moments before and after David's death. These testimonies painted a picture of Clara Harris as a woman completely overtaken by the intensity of her emotions. Witnesses not only spoke to her actions, but also described the chilling transformation in her demeanor. Before the murder, she was enraged and desperate. Afterward, she seemed hollow, as if the gravity of what she had done hadn't yet fully sunk in. But the consequences of her actions were painfully real, and the witnesses' statements would become key evidence in the trial that followed. Perhaps the most tragic figure in the entire saga was Lindsay Harris, David's teenage daughter and Clara's stepdaughter. Lindsay had been in the passenger seat of the car when Clara carried out the fatal act, and her presence would forever mark the event with an additional layer of emotional complexity. For Lindsay, the events of that night were not just a crime, they were the destruction of her family and everything she had once known. In the moments leading up to the murder, Lindsay had been drawn into Clara's plan to confront David. Though young, Lindsay was no stranger to the tensions within the marriage. She had witnessed the cracks forming between her father and stepmother and knew about the affair. Clara had convinced herself that bringing Lindsay to the hotel would help expose David's betrayal in a way that might unite them both against him. But what unfolded was far beyond anything Lindsay could have anticipated. Lindsay's testimony later revealed the profound emotional conflict she experienced that night. As Clara drove towards David, Lindsay screamed at her to stop. "Don't do this," she had begged, her voice filled with terror and disbelief. But her cries fell on deaf ears. Clara was too far gone, too consumed by her rage and heartbreak. Lindsay could do nothing but watch in horror as the events unfolded before her eyes. In the aftermath, Lindsay's emotional state was shattered. The woman who had raised her, who had once been a loving stepmother, had become the person responsible for her father's brutal death. Lindsay's relationship with Clara was irrevocably broken. Her testimony at trial would be one of the most damning pieces of evidence against Clara, recounting the night in chilling detail. Lindsay described how she felt powerless to stop what happened, how her pleas had been ignored, and how she witnessed her father's body crushed beneath the wheels of the car. Lindsay's presence in the car that night added an additional layer of tragedy to an already horrific event. Her testimony was filled with sorrow and anger at her father for his betrayal, but even more so at Clara for her unforgivable actions. Lindsay's life, like Clara's, would never be the same. Her role as both witness and victim in this tragedy left her emotionally scarred, and her courtroom testimony sealed the narrative of Clara's guilt in the public's eyes. In the immediate aftermath of the murder, Clara Harris remained at the scene, her emotions seemingly drained as the gravity of what she had done began to settle in. The once calm suburban mother and dentist now stood beside the lifeless body of her husband, surrounded by police, witnesses, and a sea of flashing lights. The Nassau Bay Hilton parking lot, now a crime scene, buzzed with chaos as law enforcement took control. Clara was arrested on the spot, her hands trembling as officers placed her in handcuffs. She appeared dazed, as though in shock, still trying to process what had just transpired. Witnesses reported that Clara made no attempt to flee the scene. In fact, she seemed almost paralyzed by the realization of what she had done. As she was led away by the police, she reportedly mumbled incoherently, her eyes vacant. The police wasted no time in filing charges. Clara Harris was charged with first-degree murder, a charge that reflected the severity and premeditated nature of her actions. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Witness testimonies, the surveillance footage captured by the private investigator, and Lindsay's harrowing account of the events all painted a clear picture of the violent, deliberate act that had taken place. Clara's initial response to the charges was one of disbelief. In the hours after her arrest, she reportedly expressed shock and confusion, unable to comprehend how her life had unraveled so quickly. Her defense would later argue that Clara had acted in the heat of passion, driven by intense emotions after discovering her husband's betrayal. But in that moment, as she sat in a police holding cell, the magnitude of her crime was slowly becoming clear. The public's reaction to Clara's arrest was swift and polarized. Some viewed her as a victim of emotional manipulation, a woman driven to the edge by her husband's infidelity. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer, someone who had taken the law into her own hands in the most brutal way possible. But no matter how the public felt, the law was clear. Clara Harris had committed murder, and now she would have to face the consequences. As the charges of first-degree murder were formally filed against her, Clara's once perfect life had become a nightmare, one that would play out in the courtroom, where her defense would try to explain away the rage-fueled actions that had led to her husband's death. But for Clara, there was no escape from the reality of what she had done. The arrest was just the beginning of a long and painful legal battle, one that would expose the full depths of her emotional unraveling and the devastating consequences of her actions. The murder of David Harris by his wife, Clara, quickly transformed from a personal tragedy to a public spectacle, thrust into the national spotlight by a relentless media storm. Dubbed by the press as the Mercedes murder, the case captivated the nation with its shocking mix of infidelity, rage, and public violence. What might have been a private family disaster turned into a tabloid sensation, with every new detail feeding the public's insatiable appetite for drama. The media painted Clara Harris as the quintessential woman scorned, a betrayed wife whose rage had exploded in the most violent and public way imaginable. Headlines screamed about the crime of passion, framing Clara as a figure driven to insanity by her husband's betrayal. Images of Clara's face, once the face of a successful dentist, plastered television screens, newspapers, and magazines across the country. The press seized upon her emotional breakdown and the fatal act, turning Clara into a symbol of jealousy and revenge. The narrative was powerful and simple. A successful woman, broken by her husband's infidelity, had taken the ultimate step of revenge. But the media coverage went deeper, digging into every aspect of Clara's life, from her career as a dentist to her marriage unraveling. The affair between David and Gail Bridges was dissected in lurid detail, and even Lindsay's involvement became part of the tragic story the media constructed. The public couldn't look away from the scandal. It was too raw, too compelling. Television, talk shows, newspapers, and radio stations ran with the story, presenting it as an almost archetypal tale of love gone wrong. Clara became a figure of fascination and debate. Some sympathized with her, believing she had been pushed to the edge by her husband's infidelity. Others condemned her, calling her a cold-blooded murderer who had crossed a line from which there was no return. Public opinion was sharply divided, and Clara Harris became a household name, the subject of both scorn and sympathy in equal measure. This constant media attention shaped the narrative even before the trial began, ensuring that when Clara finally stepped into the courtroom, she would already be viewed through the lens of public opinion. The case was no longer just a legal battle, it had become a national obsession with Clara Harris at its center. Clara's defense team faced a monumental task in the courtroom to explain her actions in a way that would save her from the harshest possible punishment. Their strategy hinged on one crucial point. Clara Harris had not acted with premeditation, but rather in a moment of uncontrollable passion. The defense painted her as a heartbroken wife, devastated by her husband's betrayal, who had acted impulsively in a fit of emotional turmoil. Clara's attorneys, George Parnham and David Schechter, argued that she was not a cold, calculating killer. Instead, they portrayed her as a woman who had been pushed to the brink by a combination of intense love and overwhelming heartbreak. In their view, the discovery of David's affair had sent Clara into an emotional spiral, culminating in a moment of temporary insanity where reason and control had completely abandoned her. To support their argument, the defense focused heavily on Clara's state of mind at the time of the incident. They presented her as a woman who had tried desperately to save her marriage, only to be met with betrayal and rejection. Clara's actions, they argued, were not premeditated but driven by the heat of the moment, fueled by raw emotions that she couldn't control. The fact that Clara had not tried to flee the scene after the incident was used as evidence that she had not acted with intent, but rather in a temporary state of emotional collapse. The defense also leaned on the narrative of Clara as a respected dentist and community figure, a woman who had lived an exemplary life before the events at the Nassau Bay Hilton. This, they argued, was not the profile of a cold-blooded killer. Instead, they sought to humanize Clara, showing the jury that she was a woman who had been tragically undone by her circumstances. Their goal was to convince the jury to reduce the charge from first-degree murder to something less severe, such as manslaughter, arguing that while Clara's actions had been wrong, they were not the result of a premeditated plan to kill her husband. The defense hoped to paint a picture of Clara as a victim of her own emotions, not a calculated murderer. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Mia Magnus, was determined to dismantle the defense's argument of passion-driven, impulsive violence. For them, this was not a case of a woman acting out of emotional despair, but a deliberate and calculated murder carried out with chilling intent. Their goal was to prove that Clara Harris had not merely acted in the heat of the moment, but had made a conscious decision to kill her husband. The prosecution's case rested heavily on two key pieces of evidence: the eyewitness testimonies and the footage captured by the private investigator Clara had hired. The witnesses who had seen Clara's actions in the hotel parking lot provided damning testimony. They described how Clara had not simply hit David once in a moment of rage, but had circled back multiple times, driving over him again and again in her Mercedes-Benz. This, the prosecution argued, showed clear intent. Clara had the opportunity to stop after the initial impact, but she chose not to. The surveillance footage gathered by the private investigator was another crucial piece of evidence. It showed Clara following David and Gail into the hotel, and later it captured the fatal scene in the parking lot. The footage not only confirmed that Clara had run over David multiple times, but also depicted her demeanor before and after the incident, which the prosecution used to argue that Clara was fully aware of what she was doing. This evidence, they said, left no doubt that Clara's actions were deliberate and premeditated. The prosecution also focused on Clara's decision to bring her stepdaughter Lindsay to the scene, arguing that this demonstrated premeditation. By involving Lindsay, Clara had created a situation where her emotions would be heightened, knowing full well that the confrontation could escalate. To the prosecution, this was not the behavior of a woman acting impulsively, but of someone who had planned, at least on some level, to confront her husband and take matters into her own hands. Magnus emphasized to the jury that Clara's repeated actions behind the wheel were not just an emotional outburst, but a calculated decision to end David's life. The prosecution framed Clara as a woman who had lost control of her emotions, but still made a conscious choice to kill. It was this choice, they argued, that constituted first-degree murder, a decision made not in the heat of passion, but with full awareness of its deadly consequences. Ultimately, the prosecution's goal was to strip away the layers of sympathy the defense tried to build around Clara and present her as a woman who had let her jealousy and anger lead her to commit a brutal, intentional act of murder. They argued that David Harris's death was not a tragic accident born from emotional pain, but a deliberate execution at the hands of his wife. The private investigator's footage became one of the most decisive pieces of evidence in the trial, turning the courtroom into a theater of undeniable truth. Clara Harris herself had hired Blue Moon Investigations to gather proof of her husband's affair with Gail Bridges. Ironically, the very tool she had intended to expose David's infidelity would become the key to her own undoing. The footage not only captured the confrontation between Clara, David, and Gail inside the Nassau Bay Hilton, but also documented the harrowing moments in the parking lot. In court, the prosecution used this footage to show the jury Clara's escalating rage and, more critically, the deliberate nature of her actions. The video revealed that after the initial impact, Clara did not stop. Instead, she circled around and struck David multiple times. It was clear and it was brutal. The images of Clara behind the wheel, her face a mixture of fury and detachment, were undeniable. The jury watched as David's body was struck repeatedly, and this visual evidence left a profound impact on them. The footage undermined any argument that Clara had acted impulsively or without intent. Her repeated actions, captured in real time, spoke louder than any defense strategy could counter. There was no ambiguity, no room for doubt. Clara had made a conscious decision to turn her car into a weapon. The prosecution wielded this footage as their most potent weapon, using it to dismantle the defense's narrative of a woman overtaken by uncontrollable emotion. For the jury, seeing was believing, and the video footage left little room for sympathy or doubt. It became the turning point in the case, swaying the jury's perception of Clara from a victim of passion to a calculated killer. Perhaps the most emotionally charged moment of the trial came when Lindsay Harris, David's teenage daughter, took the stand to testify against her stepmother. Lindsay's testimony was not just a recounting of facts. It was a deeply personal and gut-wrenching account of the night she witnessed her father's death at the hands of the woman who had helped raise her. Lindsay's presence in the car during the fatal moment made her testimony all the more significant, adding a tragic layer of betrayal and trauma to the trial. Lindsay recounted how Clara had driven them to the hotel, how she had confronted David and Gail in the lobby, and most painfully, how she had screamed at Clara to stop as the car repeatedly struck her father. The courtroom fell silent as Lindsay described her terror, her helplessness, and the overwhelming grief of watching her father die in front of her eyes. I begged her to stop, Lindsay testified, her voice trembling. But she didn't listen. She kept going. She didn't stop. Her testimony shattered whatever sympathy the defense had managed to build for Clara. Lindsay was not just a witness, she was a victim, emotionally and psychologically scarred by the events of that night. Her words carried the weight of personal trauma, and as the jury listened to her, it became clear that the impact of Clara's actions extended far beyond the crime itself. Lindsay's testimony added a raw, human dimension to the trial, making the tragedy all the more real for everyone in the courtroom. After weeks of intense testimony and compelling evidence, the jury finally reached their verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, they found Clara Harris guilty, but not of premeditated murder. Instead, they convicted her of second-degree murder, acknowledging the emotional circumstances surrounding the crime, but also recognizing the deliberate nature of her actions. The verdict was a sobering conclusion to a case that had captured national attention. Clara was sentenced to 20 years in prison, the maximum sentence for second-degree murder in Texas. The sentence sent a clear message. While the jury had acknowledged the complexities of Clara's emotional state, they could not ignore the brutality of her actions. David Harris's death was no accident, and the punishment reflected the severity of the crime. For Clara, the sentence was devastating. In an instant, her life as a respected dentist and mother was gone, replaced by the reality of life behind bars. For her family, the impact was equally profound. Her children, who had already lost their father, were now losing their mother as well, left to grapple with the emotional and psychological fallout of their parents' tragic end. The public's reaction to the sentencing was mixed. Some felt that Clara had been treated too harshly given the emotional circumstances that led to the crime. Others believed the 20-year sentence was not enough given the deliberate nature of her actions. But for those closest to the case, the sentence marked the end of a painful and tragic chapter. The public reaction to Clara Harris's conviction and sentencing was deeply divided. The case had struck a nerve across the country, with people projecting their own emotions and beliefs onto the tragic story. To some, Clara was a victim of her husband's betrayal, a woman who had been pushed to the breaking point by the ultimate act of infidelity. In their eyes, Clara's actions, while wrong, were understandable given the circumstances. These supporters felt that the sentence was too harsh, that Clara had already suffered enough for her crime. On the other hand, many saw Clara as a dangerous figure, someone who had allowed her jealousy and rage to drive her to commit a brutal murder. For this group, the fact that Clara had circled back to hit David multiple times was proof of her intent, and they believed that the 20-year sentence was not enough for such a deliberate act of violence. They viewed her as a murderer, plain and simple, and felt that justice had only partially been served. The media continued to fan the flames of public debate, with some outlets framing Clara as a tragic figure and others emphasizing the cold-blooded nature of her crime. The case had become a cultural touchstone, raising questions about love, betrayal, and the consequences of unchecked emotions. In the end, the public remained divided, but one thing was clear. The name Clara Harris would be forever associated with one of the most sensational murder cases in recent history. For Gail Bridges, the woman at the center of the affair that had triggered such a catastrophic series of events, life after the murder was far from easy. Although she had not been directly involved in the crime, Gail became a central figure in the narrative, the other woman whose relationship with David had indirectly led to his death. The public's perception of Gail was complicated. Some viewed her as a temptress who had knowingly destroyed a marriage, while others saw her as an unfortunate bystander caught in a tragic love triangle. After the trial, Gail retreated from the public eye, trying to rebuild her life in the shadow of the case. The affair had cost her dearly. Not only had she lost David, but her reputation had been dragged through the mud in the media frenzy. She became a symbol not just of the affair, but of the destructive power of infidelity and how it could lead to unimaginable consequences. Gail's involvement in the case haunted her for years. Though she had survived the fatal night at the Nassau Bay Hilton, her life would never be the same. Her name became synonymous with the tragedy, and moving forward proved to be an immense challenge. Clara Harris's life behind bars was a stark contrast to the privileged existence she had once known. In prison, Clara was no longer the successful dentist or the respected member of her community. She was an inmate serving time for the murder of her husband. The reality of her situation settled in quickly as she adjusted to the daily routines of incarceration. By all accounts, Clara was a model prisoner. She kept to herself, avoided trouble, and participated in various prison programs. Over time, she attempted to come to terms with her actions and the life-altering consequences they had brought. Despite her good behavior, Clara's attempts for early parole were met with opposition, largely due to the high-profile nature of the case and the gravity of the crime she had committed. Clara's children, now without both parents, were deeply affected by the case. The family struggled to maintain some semblance of normalcy, but the shadow of their mother's crime loomed large. Clara's time in prison created a gulf between her and her children, and the emotional toll on the family was immense. They were left to pick up the pieces of a life that had been irrevocably shattered by one tragic decision. The case of Clara Harris left an indelible mark on both the legal world and public consciousness. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of uncontrolled jealousy and the devastating consequences of acting on impulse. The case was a vivid reminder that emotions, when unchecked, could lead to irreversible actions with life-altering consequences. In the years following the trial, Clara's story continued to serve as a symbol of what happens when love turns to obsession and betrayal gives birth to rage. The Mercedes murder became a cultural reference point, a story of passion and violence that would be remembered for years to come. At its core, the legacy of Clara Harris's actions serves as a powerful reminder of how fragile human emotions can be and how, in a moment of madness, everything can come crashing down. It is a story of love lost, of lives destroyed, and of the deep scars left behind by uncontrolled rage. And in the end, it's a reminder that no matter the circumstances, the cost of violence is always too high.